Shalom, dear friends. Greetings to you. Glad to see you. Shalom, everyone. A wonderful mood. Join our broadcast. We are continuing the series of our course called After the Flame. This is the third week that we've started. This comprehensive course will thoroughly cover the entire historical period from the significant year 70 to the pivotal year 325, and it is designed to last throughout this academic year. It encompasses a truly vast and incredibly powerful amount of essential information. And if you are able to take it in this information, this course will become the greatest breakthrough in your understanding. The more knowledge you gain and the more the history of what happened is revealed to you, the more all the dust that was sprinkled on you in denominations will fall from your eyes. You will understand not only the history of the church and the development of the Christian branch. You will understand its interaction with the Jewish world, as well as the development of the Jewish path, the preservation of the people of Israel, and their formation up to the present day. All these knowledge bases are taught in Israel at the Open University of Israel, where I drew all this information from. I invite you to this amazing journey. Today we are exploring a fascinating topic called Who were the Nazarenes and the Ebionites? These are lost paths that were crushed by the two orthodoxies that were forming at that time. But they were not the only ones present on this stage. There were also other movements which, of course, the Church would later recognize as heretical as well. But always, at all times and up to this very day, the path of Israel has been preserved. So today is our 8th lesson. And today we are diving into one of the most confusing, tragic, and important topics for understanding how the paths of the synagogue and the church diverged. They didn't just diverge back then, they continue to diverge to this day. It's a path that has lasted millennia. Is it possible to unite what has been separated for thousands of years? This is the question of all questions. And can we unite it on the very grounds upon which it was divided? That, too, remains the question of all questions. We will talk about those whom history has almost erased from its pages, about those who ended up being heretics to everyone. Now, this pervasive stigma throughout all of recorded times, this deeply ingrained stigma has been consistently used, and even today it is still actively used, pointed directly at, and indelibly branded onto anyone who doesn't quite fit the general accepted course of orthodoxy. The topic of our lesson today is Nazarenes and Ebionites. So, just 5 minutes to recap what we've studied together. In previous lessons, we saw how, after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, the world of Israel's faith found itself at a crossroads. But it wasn't just Israel. The Messianic path found itself in exactly the same situation. In Jabna, the sages were gathering together the heritage of Israel, forming rabbinic or rabbinical Judaism. Meanwhile, throughout the Roman Empire, communities of Gentiles were growing, inspired by Paul's letters. But what happened to those who were in the middle? What happened to the first Jewish believers who accepted Yeshua as their Messiah, but who never stopped being Jews? After all, they were the direct heirs of the first community of disciples in Jerusalem. Studying this history is by no means an easy task. As historian Marcel Simon writes, we know about them almost exclusively from the writings of their opponents, both Jewish and Christian. In other words, we have practically nothing from them in their own words. We have nothing from them themselves. All we have are the descriptions written by their enemies. Their own voices are almost unheard. They are a lost link, crushed between two emerging orthodoxies. On one side, the developing orthodoxy of the synagogue, and on the other, the forming orthodoxy of the church. Today, we will talk about the testimonies of the church fathers, who, of course, were opposed to them. Let's try to reconstruct their true image and understand the reasons for their disappearance. So, the Ebionites. Ebionim in Hebrew means the poor. The poor. This was a kind of radical wing. Let's start with this very group which drew the most condemnation. As you can see, the name speaks for itself. They called themselves the poor, the needy. Who were they in the eyes of the church fathers? Let's turn to one of the earliest testimonies, that of Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote around the year 180. He gives us 4 clear characteristics. In other words, all the people we read about them, but we don't read them themselves. That's a big problem. So, first, the Ebionites, their view of Yeshua. They believed that Yeshua was an ordinary man. Irenaeus writes, again quoting him, "They claim that he was born of Joseph. They completely rejected his divinity and his birth from the Virgin." Again, this is according to his words. From their point of view, the Messiah is just an ordinary person whom God chose for his righteousness. This teaching is called adoptionism. They used only one gospel, the so-called Gospel of Matthew. It was probably one of the early Hebrew versions of the gospel, not the one we use today in the synodal or other versions. That version has not come down to us. It hasn't survived. It's quite possible they used something that was inconvenient and even dangerous. They did not accept the Apostle Paul. This is a key point. Irenaeus says, they reject the Apostle Paul, calling him an apostate from the law. For the Ebionites, Paul was the main enemy who distorted the teachings of Yeshua. From my point of view, I would add maybe they misread him, or maybe they knew something we don't. But we also have another group which we will talk about as well. They insisted on the strictest observance of the Torah. Irenaeus emphasizes, they scrupulously follow the prescriptions of the law to the point of adopting a Jewish way of life so thoroughly that they literally worship Jerusalem as if it were the house of God. Well, Jerusalem really is the house of God, the city where the Almighty dwells. Of course, you shouldn't worship it as God. But for the Greeks of that period, even that was already too much. After all, they destroyed Jerusalem. This includes circumcision, kashrut, and all the other commandments. The Ebionites essentially demanded that all believers, including Gentiles, become full-fledged Jews. Because of this radical view, they ended up in complete isolation. They were rejected by absolutely everyone. That is, on one hand, the synagogue didn't accept them because they accepted Yeshua the Messiah. And by that time, orthodoxy had already formed in Jabna, which had developed its own stance toward all these groups. On the other hand, they couldn't fit into the Christianity that was taking shape at the time. So they were caught between a rock and a hard place. Let's read on. The next group is the Nazarenes, Nazarene. My friends, everything I'm reading to you comes from academic knowledge in Israel. This knowledge is taught in Israel. It's not some random information I'm getting from somewhere. These things are taught at our open Jewish university. So the Nazarenes who are Nazarene are not the same as Christians. And also Nazareth, which is Nazarete, is also derived from the word Nazar, meaning guardians. Guardians. Nazarene means guardians. It is exactly this word, Nazarene, that Jews today use to refer to Christians. For Jews today, all Christians are Nazarene. That's just how it is, and that's how it has stayed. No one in Israel calls Protestants. They don't even know those words. They know Catholicism for Catholics, Orthodoxim for Orthodox, but in Israel, they're all called Nazarene. But if we look deeper into who the Nazarene really were, the guardians, the keepers of the heritage, then we'll understand what it's all about. Let's move on to another group. This group was more moderate and perhaps more numerous. They were called Nazarenes or Nazarene. For a long time, historians confused them with the Ebionites, but thanks to the church fathers of the 4th century, we can see a clear distinction. Our main source is Epiphanius of Salamis. Again, everything we know about them is written from the words of others. We know nothing about them from their own words because everything was suppressed and destroyed. Epiphanius of Salamis was a fierce fighter against heresies. If I had lived in his time, I would have already been burned at the stake. But he also tried to be accurate. David, thank you. My friends, hit the like button, and click the thank you button. The main witness here is Epiphanius of Salamis. He was a fierce fighter against heresies, but he tried to be accurate. Tried, that's the key word. Here's what he writes about the Nazarenes. They are Jews and nothing more. What can you expect from them? They're just Jews. However, they agree neither with the Jews nor with the Christians. Not with the Jews because they believe in Christ, and not with the Christians because they still adhere to the law of circumcision, the Sabbath, and so on. This is according to Epiphanius, who fought against them and, explains it all with a kind of smirk. They're Jews. What can you expect from them? Vladimir, he gets this from the words of their enemies. Yes, that's exactly how I explained it from the very beginning. Like the Ebionites and the Ebionites, they observed the law of Moses. It was an inseparable part of their national spiritual identity. They were truly Jews. They weren't pagans who had converted. They were originally Jews. Unlike the Ebionites, the Nazarenes adhered to the Orthodox faith in the person of the Messiah. What is the essence of Orthodox faith? Epiphanius states directly, "As for Christ, I do not know whether they consider him a mere man or assert, as is true, that he was born of the Virgin Mary by the Holy Spirit." Later, Jerome, who personally interacted with the Nazarenes in Syria, Alex, thank you, summarizes and confirms, They believed in the divinity of Yeshua. That is, the Nazarenes, they believed in the divinity of Yeshua. That's right, because we also believe in divinity. Unlike the Ebionites, the Nazarenes did not reject Paul, which is wonderful. We also do not reject Paul. We study him and examine him closely. They acknowledged his apostleship to the Gentiles. Essentially, for the Gentiles, that's exactly what he was. He was the apostle to the Gentiles, while James and Peter were apostles to the Jews. Essentially, the Nazarenes are the direct continuation of that first Jerusalem community led by James, which fled to Petra before the destruction of the temple. Again, this is a Christian tradition that they fled to Petra. We don't have any confirmation in Israel that they fled to Petra before the destruction of the temple. Maybe some of them escaped, but essentially, there's nothing to suggest that they all relocated, every single one of them. They tried to maintain the perfect balance. They tried to be faithful to the Torah as Jews. They were Jews and faithful to the Messiah as his disciples. In principle, the Nazarenes are very similar to us. I mean, Messianism today and my own beliefs today are very similar to those of the Nazarenes. That's exactly the essence of who they were. I also believe in the divinity of the Mashiach. It's impossible not to believe in that, and to deny that would be wrong. This divinity, first and foremost, is layered upon his human nature. So why did these groups, especially the moderate Nazarenes, disappear? Because they ended up caught between a rock and a hard place. So after the destruction of the temple, Rabbinic Judaism consolidated, meaning it closed ranks and very strictly purged everything that was on the fringes. Because, as I've told you before in previous broadcasts, this was basically a faith for survival. Faith in Yeshua as the divine Messiah began to be seen as a threat to the purity of monotheism. At that time, theology or Christology hadn't even formed yet, you see? All those developments came later. But the Nazarenes would never have accepted that. All the Christology that later came from the Greek fathers or others was foreign to the Jews. We know that in the synagogue there was the Birkat Haminim prayer, that is, the so-called blessings directed at heretics. All loose ends and outliers were being eliminated. In other words, the core of Rabbinic Judaism was formed because the threat was enormous. Jews were being destroyed, and out of fear, they were fleeing to other places. The main task, the most important task of the leading sages, was to preserve Judaism as a faith and the Jewish people as an ethnic group. That's why everything was being protected, and they ended up in this defensive state. Meanwhile, the church was becoming increasingly non-Jewish. Observance of the Torah began to be regarded as heresy. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, wrote with regret about the Nazarenes. With regret. Wanting to be both Jews and Christians at the same time, they end up being neither one nor the other. I believe he was wrong. They were Jews, and no one could take that Jewishness away from them. However, not all church fathers were so categorical. For example, Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew in the middle of the 2nd century, demonstrates a remarkable breadth of perspective. When Trypho asks him whether a Jew who believes in Yeshua can continue to observe the law and whether he can be saved, Justin Martyr replies, I think that even those who wish to observe the ordinances given by Moses can be saved, provided that they believe in him. However, I do not think that they should compel the Gentiles, who have also come to believe in Christ, to observe the same rites under threat of refusing fellowship with them. First of all, I agree with this. No one should ever be forced to do anything, especially not under threat. We shouldn't force people, we should educate and teach them. When a Gentile understands the goodness, the true blessing contained in the Torah, he will gladly follow it. But if you try to force someone, nothing good will come of it. Justin is willing to accept them. What a big favor he did, if only they don't impose their way on others. But unfortunately, his moderate position did not prevail. That's exactly how it was. By the 4th century, the Church, having become a state institution, finally condemned the heresy of the Judaizers as heretics. Judaizers as heretics. Practically in their eyes, everyone, including Peter, Paul, and the entire community in Jerusalem, were all Judaizing heretics. So, even Yeshua himself was considered a Judaizing heretic. Thus, Jewish believers found themselves in an unbearable position of double rejection. Alex, thank you. They were, so to speak, too Christian for the synagogue and too Jewish for the church. The story of the Nazarenes and the Ebionites is not just a page from the past. It's the tragedy of a path that never came to be, which left a deep wound in the body of the Messiah. Their disappearance shows that the rift between Judaism and Christianity was never overcome, and it still hasn't been overcome to this day. But back then, only a generation or two had passed, while today, thousands of years have gone by. This division was the result of historical catastrophes, political decisions, and theological disputes in which the golden mean was destroyed. I think that if the political situation hadn't been so tense, and if Jerusalem hadn't been destroyed by the Romans, if the Jews hadn't needed to survive by practically clearing everything out and burning everything with napalm just to preserve themselves and the Torah, it's quite possible that the Nazarenes wouldn't have been rejected. It's quite possible they would have continued to exist, just like today. For example, progressive Judaism or certain branches of Hasidism or other branches coexist perfectly well within Judaism. You see what I mean? If the Nazarenes, since they observed the commandments, they were Jews, they weren't pagans, they were Jews by their very nature. And I think that if they were living in our times, no one would even think of rejecting them. I believe they would have their own synagogues in Israel, their own movements, their own currents in life, and no one would say a single word against them. But the significant and pervasive problem was that they lived in the most incredibly difficult and challenging time of widespread catastrophes, when that particular era truly demanded decisive and resolute actions that absolutely required a complete and thorough purging of itself. And it wasn't just the synagogue that was purged. In the end, the Christian path was also purged, which likewise cut off all loose ends, eliminated all dissenters, and everyone who didn't fit into the victorious Alexandrian orthodoxy. We will still talk about all of this together. About everything, we still have a very long road ahead of us. And right here, right at this point, we come to our prophetic calling today. These are interesting things because the modern Messianic movement should not simply be a reconstruction, you see, or just some kind of post-Christian or neo-Christian church. The Messianic movement is God's answer to a centuries-old division. In other words, we are called to restore what was destroyed. Practically speaking, we live in completely different times today. We do not live in an era where dissenters are rejected. We live in a time when anyone with different views can freely express them. We do not live in a time when heretics were burned at the stake, made outcasts, driven from their cities, and called heretics. In reality, they were not heretics. They were simply people who understood their path differently. Today, these people would fit in perfectly well in our world. It's quite possible that they would have been that bridge, but they did not live to see our days. That's why everything always comes back. History always goes backward. It's cyclical and always returns to those places for restoration. This is the greatest tikkun, that we are given the opportunity to restore what was destroyed. So, today the Messianic movement might be the answer to this centuries-old division. But this division has existed for thousands of years, and we're trying to fix it and patch it up in a short period of time. Is that even possible? No. For that to become possible, the foundation needs to change on both sides. On the side of Judaism, there needs to be acceptance of everyone who observes the commandments of the Torah, regardless of their nationality. And on the side of the Messianic movement, there must be a study of the Jewish world, Judaism, an immersion in the commandments, a return to the Torah. Do you think that's impossible? Everything is possible. I believe we are living in these wonderful times when the Creator is gathering a completely new path. A completely new path. It's a living bridge between Israel and the nations. The synagogue cannot reach the nations. Today it has no tools for that. It is closed, its doors are shut, and you can't just come in, you have to show a Jewish passport. But the Messianic community can be open. It can have an inner synagogue. It can possess the inner spirit of Israel. And people there, even without Jewish nationality, can be Jews in their hearts. They might even be more Zionist than the Jews who are actually in the synagogue. Because we must exist without fear, without isolation, without intimidation, without passports. And our community is a community without walls. The Messianic movement is not just a reconstruction. Once again, it's a response to a centuries-old division. It's a living bridge that we are beginning to build. In turn, Orthodox Christians tell us this is heresy. We don't want anything to do with Judaizing heretics. We've heard this somewhere before. We've already been through this in history. We've already had all of this. But they don't actually study history. That's why I suggest you study it, so you can understand that we're not actually creating anything new. We're just repeating what was once lost. Our task is to show the world that it is possible to believe in the Messiah as the Mashiach, to recognize him as the Son of God, of course, to recognize him as the Son of God, and at the same time remain an integral part of the people of Israel, loving and observing the Torah. We can live this kind of life even without accepting orthodoxy. Without accepting orthodoxy from any side. We are called to turn the seeking remnant of the church back to their Jewish roots, to restore them to the fullness of faith of the first community, where Jews and non-Jews were united without losing their identities. I think that at the beginning of the journey, it was impossible to create this. But after going through such a painful path and such a terrible history, now, only with this history, does the opportunity arise to create it. This is a great ministry of healing and restoration. Because the way things are happening now, it cannot go on like this. The Messiah cannot come to this earth in this way. He cannot come only for the Jews. He must come for the whole world. And for that, the great harvest must be gathered. But the Messiah will not come to New York. He will come to Jerusalem. And that's why the church must return to its true identity. It must become the Nazarenes that the first apostles were, not the pagans they later turned into. This is a great ministry of healing and restoration, friends. In other words, by studying the mistakes of the past, we learn and build our future. And we are living in times when this has become possible. It wasn't possible back then. No matter how much the Apostle Paul or Peter or James wanted it, it was impossible. It will become possible in our time because we already have a vast history of division. And the history of division is necessary. It is fundamentally important. It is precisely on the foundation of what was wrong that what is right is built. So when we look at those first people, we shouldn't demand some great truthfulness from them. We shouldn't think that they had to meet every requirement. My friends, we shouldn't even have these thoughts in our heads. They were feeling their way forward, caught between two worlds. At the most difficult historical moment in the existence of their story. On one hand, they believed in Yeshua, and on the other hand, they were Jews. Yeah. If they were alive today, they would be part of the Messianic movement. And honestly, we would be glad to talk with them. We would sit at their feet and listen to every word they said. But their writings were destroyed, their manuscripts were wiped out. Everything they knew was erased from the pages of history, and all we know about them comes from their enemies, who talk about them, not from them telling us anything about themselves. That's why we are living in wonderful times, and there's absolutely no need to look at these times as if it's the greatest apocalypse and the Antichrist is about to come. My friends, we are living in the most amazing times when no one is chasing after you, no one is persecuting you, no one is burning you or skinning you alive, no one is stripping you of your citizenship or throwing you out of the country for your faith or your beliefs. Today, we are living in the best of times when freedom of speech and religion is preserved. And Israel preserves this freedom. And it is on this freedom that, sooner or later, this path will begin in Israel. It has already begun, it already exists, but it's still in diapers. And all the development of Messianism, the Messianic branch that exists in all countries and cities, and all the Messianic groups, they look to Israel first and foremost. And they expect the birth of their path to come from here, just as it was from the very beginning. That's precisely why my significant task as a dedicated teacher and esteemed rabbi in the land of Israel, my crucial task is to diligently create this essential path. My friends, tomorrow, There will be an absolutely amazing and truly insightful lesson. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the Gnostics, about ancient Greek philosophy, about the significant and often complex clash between Greek philosophy and traditional Jewish wisdom, about the profound and widespread misunderstanding of the sacred Torah, and about how the Torah's unique perspective actually fundamentally contradicts, the very core understanding of Greek thought. And we'll see how, even to this day, a huge number of ideas about God and his ways actually come not from the Bible, but from Greek Gnosticism and other philosophical concepts. This whole week, I'll step away from the Jewish line and we'll focus exclusively on this topic, just on this. So, tomorrow we'll talk about who the Gnostics and Hellenes are, and the problem of Greek philosophy in general, and its overall clash. Tomorrow's lesson will be very interesting. I recommend you don't miss it. We'll also talk about the Didache, but that will be the next day. I think that will be on TH on Thursday. And the issue of the identity of the synagogue and the church. All this week, we'll be discussing these topics before we return to Jewish history. Each of these historical broadcasts is available in our playlist called After the Flame. And you can always refer to it if you want to listen to something or any lesson from the very beginning. Each lesson has its own number, its own title, and its own description. All these things are available on our YouTube in the playlist. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, my friends. Give us a like, subscribe, and donate. I'll say goodbye for now, and we'll see each other again tomorrow. Shalom to everyone.